Hey guys, this is Lucas with Better Coding Academy. I've been using GraphQL for over a year now. I've used it to design the entirety of a node.js API with over 60,000 lines of code, and I'm currently using it on another node.js API with 20,000 lines of code. As such, I have quite a fair bit of experience with GraphQL, so in this video, I'm going to provide a fair review of my experiences using this technology. This is not an introductory how-to video on GraphQL. Instead, I see too many people trying to goad others onto the GraphQL hype train without properly describing the other side of the story, so this is what this video is aiming to provide. If you go onto GraphQL's website, you'll see that it calls itself a query language. This is important to note. GraphQL is not specifically a JavaScript thing. In fact, the core backbone of GraphQL is a language-agnostic specification document maintained by Facebook. Many of the things that GraphQL aims to address make it somewhat of an alternative to REST, but I'll explain more on that later. Now, there are quite a few misunderstandings I had when I first tried to learn GraphQL, specifically with regards to what GraphQL is not. It is not a database, it does not fetch your data, and it does not care where your data comes from. You're expected to fetch the data in whatever way you want, and GraphQL simply collects all of it and returns it appropriately. It also cannot completely replace REST, nor is it designed to, but in many cases, including in the two projects I've worked on, it has actually been something that we've used to build on top of our existing REST API. I want to talk a bit about the bandwagon effect. I find that it happens a lot in dev and technology circles, especially, for example, the release of a new phone, the release of folding screens, or whatever it might be. When something new comes out, there's always loads of people talking about how everyone should use it and how it will change the world and all of that. And I saw this play out in real time with things like blockchain, cryptocurrency, TypeScript, GraphQL, and artificial intelligence, amongst many others. And the one thing I now know is that it's never as good as it's hyped to be. Never. So yeah, when you hear about a new technology, just make sure that you give it a proper go yourself before you chuck it into a production environment. Otherwise, you might just get information overload and you might become jack of all trades, master of none. If it's a new technology, also consider throwing some curveballs at it. Many new libraries and frameworks don't have support for all of the edge cases in a production environment program just yet. And if you don't do your research beforehand, you'll notice you need a feature and then find that, for example, the GitHub issue for that feature has been open for over a year with no end in sight. That's happened to me before. So yeah, just really be careful and just make sure you know what you're getting into. To be fair though, I do think that GraphQL is mostly deserving of the hype surrounding it. There are quite a few advantages to using GraphQL, and quite a few things improve when you implement it as part of your site. You can specify exactly what data you want. The GraphQL query language essentially allows you to cherry pick and only fetch the values you need for a particular page or view, which could be both a bandwidth saver and a performance saver, depending on the query and depending on how you fetch the data. Because of the way GraphQL is designed, the GraphQL clients that implement it in the front end, like Apollo and Relay, can much more easily do network optimizations, such as caching existing data to prevent refetching the same information. Another major benefit I found is how easy it is to test queries and mutations. I used to use Postman when testing my REST requests, and I always found that to be really a hassle. However, GraphQL is built into the GraphQL Express library, and GraphQL Playground is built into Apollo server, and both of these make it a lot easier to test existing GraphQL queries and also to mess around with new ones as you're designing them. However, this next slide here is the part that I find many people forget to include or just really are completely ignorant about. Existing server-side GraphQL implementations have no support for middleware, which can raise some real structure concerns that you need to address early on. So there is no easy way to set up middleware for each field, like what you can do with an Express endpoint. So it makes certain things like restricting certain routes quite a hassle. For example, you might want to have a few routes only accessible when logged in as a specific user. And out of the box, GraphQL provides no real way for you to do that. However, this can be addressed with a bit of code, so you just need to make sure that you set this up properly and just remember to do this infrastructure stuff early on in the development process. Otherwise, when you find yourself chugging through and soldiering on with 2,000 lines of GraphQL resolvers, it might be a lot harder to refactor. The out-of-box error handling experience is also quite crappy and leaves much to be desired, and you probably should spend some time setting up your server and client to cooperate with each other when handling all types of errors. You have errors that are triggered by GraphQL, you have errors that are triggered by the resolver code, you have errors that are thrown within your application on purpose, and you need to figure out how to handle all of these correctly within GraphQL. Another issue that won't come up as often, but it will come up, and especially has come up for me quite a few times now, is if you're fetching a list of a particular data type and then fetching fields within each of those data types. For example, sometimes you might be fetching 1,000 users, and then for each user you might want to fetch a website URL. So let's just assume that this website URL must be fetched from an external API, which takes, say, for example, 1 second or so. So then you would have to run this request to the external API 1,000 times, and this could be really, really bad. So to get around this issue, consider using this utility called Data Loader. Now this utility is developed by Facebook to help fix this exact issue. It allows you to batch fetch the website URLs in a single request, combining, say, all 1,000 load requests into a single request. So it basically, you have a function and it just gives you an array containing all 1,000 user IDs, and then using those IDs, you somehow figure out how to fetch 1,000 in one go. So it's very, very small, but it adds a massive performance benefit if you know how to use it correctly. Alternatively, if you find that performance is still too poor, consider just using REST. One of the big benefits of using REST is that you have entire control over each and every single route and endpoint and all of the data returned by it, which allows you to do some performance optimizations in far less code than if you were using GraphQL. It's also not an either or type thing. You know, if you have a single route that you feel would work better on REST, then consider using REST for just that route and GraphQL for everything else. I personally use GraphQL most of the time, but I always use REST for authentication. For example, whether it be to log in or to log out. Okay, so that's my summary of Facebook's GraphQL. I still think it's really great and recommend that you give it a go, but I also want to make it clear that it is not the silver bullet to all of your troubles, and that as with all things hyped up in the popular media, you should make your own clear, informed decision based on the context of your work and requirements. This has been Lucas with Better Coding Academy, and see you guys later.